A bell that tolls only in memory can be louder than any sound. This mystery begins not with blood, but with a whisper at Windsor Crossing, where silence becomes accusation and guilt leaves echoes long after justice is served. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step into the hush between two chimes and listen for what was never meant to be heard. It was upon an October evening of peculiar stillness that I found myself once more within the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street. A thin veil of fog clung to the window panes, blurring the gas lamps beyond and muting the stir of passing cabs to a distant murmur. Within, the atmosphere was warm and steeped in the fragrance of tobacco. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, the violin resting idle upon his lap, his eyes half closed, yet unmistakably alert. I had come without urgency, seeking only the company of my friend and perhaps a quiet exchange by the fire. Yet, as so often occurred in that chamber, the ordinary had no safe harbour. Holmes, though silent, radiated a peculiar expectancy, as though awaiting the arrival of something already observed. A log cracked in the grate. "You will find the evening interesting, Watson," he said at length, without lifting his gaze, "not for the case, which is dull, but for the residue it leaves behind." I turned to inquire further, but a sharp rap at the door forestalled my question. Mrs. Hudson entered with the announcement that a Colonel Hulbray requested an audience. Holmes merely smiled. Right on time. Colonel Hulbray entered with the precision one expects of a military man, erect, orderly, and faintly perfumed with cigar smoke and horses. His moustache bristled with confidence, though a faint streak of weariness lingered in the lines beneath his eyes. He apologised for the intrusion and explained that he had merely stopped by on his way to Kensington to inquire about a certain solicitor known to Holmes. The matter, he assured us, was hardly pressing. Holmes gestured to the seat opposite. "Before we address your inquiry, may I relieve myself of a small observation, Colonel?" The man nodded affably. "You took the early train from Reading, disembarked at Paddington, and walked here by way of Crawford Street, pausing no more than a minute beneath the overpass near Montague Square. You are recently returned from the country and spent the better part of yesterday at an artillery exhibition near Silchester." The Colonel stared in frank astonishment. "Upon my honour, sir, that is most accurate. Most alarmingly so." Holmes rose to remove the man's overcoat with practised courtesy. "The clay on your boots is distinctly Hampshire, and the iron soot along your cuff suggests close proximity to cannon smoke. But it is this," he plucked at the faint grey dust near the man's lapel, "that intrigues me most." "Gunpowder?" "No," Holmes replied softly. "Chime dust." The Colonel laughed heartily. "Well, I've no idea what you make of that, sir, but if bells are your trade, you've outfoxed me entirely." Holmes smiled faintly but said nothing further. After a few more pleasantries, Colonel Hulbray took his leave, appearing both entertained and vaguely unsettled by Holmes's effortless scrutiny. When the door had shut and the echo of his steps faded down the stair, I turned to my friend with curiosity sharpened. "What, precisely, is chime dust, Holmes?" He returned to the hearth, folding his hands behind his back. "A peculiar substance, Watson, composed chiefly of bell metal oxidized into a fine particulate over time. One usually finds it in aged belfries, though rarely in a man's clothing unless he has handled a long disused bell or stood too near one rung in haste." "Then you believe he came near such a thing today?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, "though I suspect he did not hear it." I frowned. "A bell that rings unheard. You are being needlessly cryptic." To this he offered a half smile. "Not cryptic, my dear Watson, merely cautious, for there are sounds which ring not in air, but in guilt." I remained by the window, watching the fog swirl like pale smoke around the gaslight. Holmes had returned to his violin, but did not play. Instead, he held it as though it were an object of contemplation rather than melody. There was a pause, in which only the faint ticking of the mantelpiece clock was audible. "You are suggesting," I said slowly, that some bells toll for the mind rather than the ear. Precisely, Holmes replied. There are instruments constructed not to announce the hour or summon the devout, but to awaken conscience. Such bells, when rung, do not disturb the street, but they may drive a man to silence or confession, depending upon the weight of his memory. I was silent, for something in his tone had grown grave. You heard the Colonel laugh, he continued, but the dust was real, and it is not the first time this week I have encountered such traces, though the others came from a very different place. He turned abruptly and met my gaze. Have you ever heard of Windsor Crossing? The name stirred nothing in my recollection. No, I admitted. You will, he said. And when you do, listen carefully, not for what you hear, but for what you do not. The morning following Colonel Holbray's curious visit dawned grey and chill, with a fine rain misting the panes and softening the usual clatter of Baker Street. We had scarcely finished our breakfast when Mrs. Hudson reappeared, her expression marked by a deference I had come to associate with clients of considerable refinement. "A lady, sir," she murmured, "who says she is expected." Holmes raised an eyebrow, though not in surprise. "Show her in." The figure who entered was possessed of that quiet composure which speaks not of timidity, but of long familiarity with sorrow. Her garments, though simple, were exquisitely tailored. Black bombazine with a single pearl at the collar. A mourning brooch framed in jet fastened her shawl. She moved with measured grace, her gaze flicking to Holmes with cautious intent, and then to me, as if seeking reassurance. "Lady Eugenia Pellingham," Holmes said gently, without being introduced. "Of the old mill house at Windlesham. You have come about the bell." A flicker of surprise crossed her countenance. "Then you have already heard?" "No," Holmes replied, gesturing for her to sit. "But I have learned to recognize the expression of one who hears that which others cannot." Once seated, Lady Eugenia composed herself with visible effort. She had the air of one who did not often indulge in confession, yet had determined that concealment had become intolerable. Her voice was low and cultivated, with the faintest trace of fatigue beneath its poise. "For 7 nights now," she began, "as the sun slips behind the trees of Windsor Crossing, a bell rings across the moor." Holmes inclined his head, silently inviting elaboration. "I do not speak of metaphor, Mr. Holmes. It is clear and distinct, a single toll, soft but undeniable, always at dusk, always from the same place." She paused, and her gloved hands clenched against one another. "The toll gate near the old stream," she continued. "It was closed a generation ago. The gatehouse is abandoned, the bell long removed, or so I believed. Yet the sound returns each evening, as if summoned from the past." I leaned forward. "Have others heard it?" "2 of the groundsmen, and my housekeeper, though she pretends otherwise. The villagers speak of it only in whispers. Some call it the widow's bell, though I do not know the origin of that name." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And you yourself, Lady Eugenia, what do you believe it signifies?" She hesitated before answering. "An omen, perhaps, or a warning." "It was near the crossing," she said softly, "that my husband died." The words were spoken without embellishment, but the silence that followed them was laden with memory. 10 years ago this spring, he was riding alone through the lower woods. They said his horse slipped upon the wet stones of the bridge. He was found the next morning, his neck broken. It was ruled an accident, of course. The constable was a well-meaning man, but not inquisitive. Holmes did not interrupt. I saw his fingers steeple beneath his chin, a posture he often assumed when he sensed the shape of some deeper pattern. "I had only been married a short time," she continued. "We had no children, only my ward, Thomas, who was 12 then. I made my peace with the verdict. Until now." Her eyes, though composed, had taken on a distant, almost haunted gleam. "For this bell, this sound, it comes not only from the place where Edmund died, But at the very hour it is said he must have fallen, I felt a subtle tightening in my chest. It was not that I believed in such omens, but there was something in her tone, a calmness too precise to be anything but deeply rooted fear. "It is not only the past that troubles me, Mr. Holmes," she said, turning slightly toward him. "It is what may yet come." Holmes gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "My ward, Thomas Wriothesley, has lived with me since he was a child. He is 22 now, thoughtful, private, unusually sensitive to sound. Music unsettles him. Church bells drive him to silence." She paused, as though selecting her words with particular care. "Last week, after the second evening of the tolling, he came to me in some distress. He asked whether I believed a sound could travel from one century to another. I dismissed it as poetic fancy, but he grew quiet, withdrawn. 2 days later, he vanished." "Vanished," I echoed. She inclined her head. "Without luggage, without word, he left behind only this." From her reticule she produced a single envelope, unsealed but folded neatly. Holmes took it delicately and opened it. The note within bore no signature, only a line written in a tense, angular hand. He heard it too. Holmes regarded the paper in silence. Then he looked up. "I presume you do not know to whom he refers?" Lady Eugenia shook her head. "But something tells me the bell is not tolling for me alone." Holmes remained motionless for a time, the note resting upon his fingertips. Then, with a slight nod, he returned it to the envelope and placed it beside his tea. "You are wise to come, Lady Eugenia," he said quietly. "For if sound is being used as a weapon, it must be traced to its source and silenced." She rose, gratitude flickering in her expression though not spoken aloud. As she departed, Holmes turned to me. "Windsor Crossing, Watson," he said, reaching for his pipe. "Let us see what echoes remain when the bell itself is nowhere to be found." Our journey to Windsor Crossing commenced under a pewter-coloured sky, the countryside awash with the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. The railway line carried us westward through a landscape surrendered to early autumn, trees already shedding their golden coats and hedgerows cloaked in a thin skein of mist. Holmes sat opposite me, silent as ever in transit, his gaze fixed not upon the fields, but upon the shifting clouds beyond the window, as though watching for something invisible to my eye. We alighted at a rural station some miles from Windlesham, where a closed carriage awaited us, arranged no doubt by Lady Eugenia's quiet efficiency. As the wheels turned over the muddy lane, I noted the gradual thickening of the fog, its pale tendrils curling over fence posts and coiling round the gnarled trunks of beech and ash. We passed a crumbling milestone, weather-worn and moss-flecked, before reaching a fork in the road where the driver halted. "There," he said, pointing with his whip. "The toll house, sir." The structure stood at the edge of a bramble-choked lane, a squat, shuttered building with a broken gate arm half-rotted and draped in ivy. Beyond it stretched a narrow bridge, little more than stone and moss now, vanishing into the trees like a path abandoned by time. Holmes stepped down and breathed in slowly. "You feel it, Watson?" I nodded, though uncertain of what I felt. Dread? Memory? Or the faint, intangible vibration of something not quite yet heard? The gatehouse door yielded to Holmes's gentle pressure, revealing an interior thick with dust and silence. The air held that dry, metallic scent particular to long unvisited places, rust, decayed wood, and the faint trace of char. I lit a small lantern from my case, casting its glow across the uneven floorboards and stone hearth. Cobwebs laced the corners like silken warnings, and a scatter of leaves had gathered where a broken shutter allowed the wind to creep in. Holmes moved with quiet precision, examining every surface without haste. His fingers brushed across the wall where a bell rope might once have hung. The bracket remained, though empty, and a faint arc of discoloration suggested something once swung above the threshold. He turned his gaze upward. "The ceiling, Watson. Do you see it?" I followed his eyes. A faint blackening marred the rafters at irregular intervals, scorch marks, no more than the width of a coin. Beside them, a fine residue clung to the beams, like coal dust but duller, finer. Soot, I asked. Of a kind, Holmes murmured, but not from a hearth. He retrieved a pocket glass and scraped a fragment into a vial. This is residue from combustion, but the heat source is neither domestic nor accidental. Someone engineered fire here, and not for warmth. I said nothing, for the sense of intrusion had deepened. It was not the ruin that unsettled me, but the unmistakable feeling that something had been carefully removed. Not broken, not forgotten, removed. Outside the gatehouse, we encountered a solitary figure walking with the aid of a cane. A man of advanced age, his coat worn to the lining and his boots caked with marshland clay. He regarded us with mild suspicion, which gave way to reluctant civility when Holmes addressed him by name. "Mr. Alcombe, formerly of the toll house, if I am not mistaken." "Aye," the old man replied, his voice rasping like dry reeds. "Kept it nigh 30 years till they closed it up. That'd be 73 or thereabouts." Holmes gestured toward the building. "You were here the night Lord Pellingham met his end." Alcombe's eyes narrowed. "That I was. He rode past me at dusk, full gallop. Weather was turning. Next morning, they found him down by the stream, poor soul." "Did you hear anything unusual that night?" The man hesitated, casting a glance toward the toll house. "Just the bell." "But there was no bell," I interjected. "You said it had been removed." He nodded slowly. "Aye, and yet I heard it. Once, just as the light was failing. Soft, faint, but it rang all the same." Holmes said nothing, but I saw the glint in his eye. A ghostly bell, it seemed, had rung long before it ever tolled for Thomas. Our inquiries led us, by way of the local chapel, to the modest dwelling of the Reverend Shipley, who mentioned a curious witness, a boy of about 10, mute since infancy, but possessed of a sharp mind and remarkable faculty for observation. He was the son of a thatcher, known in the village by the simple name of Eli, and spent much of his time drawing in chalk upon the flagstones near the market green. When we came upon him, he was crouched before the old lich gate, tongue pressed to his lower lip in the manner of the wholly absorbed, sketching with fierce attention. He did not look up as we approached, but continued shaping the image beneath his hand. A bell, large and heavy-looking, suspended not by rope but by a narrow rod fixed into an angular bracket. It was oddly detailed and bore a curious asymmetry, a protrusion at one side, like a pipe or vent, sketched with careful emphasis. Holmes knelt beside him. "You've seen this, haven't you?" The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Holmes tapped the protruding edge. "Where was this?" Eli paused, then pointed, not to the gatehouse, but toward the thicket east of the bridge, where the old culvert ran beneath the crossing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So it was not only heard, but seen, and by one who cannot be made to forget it. At Holmes's request, we paid a visit to Constable Tregennis, a stout, methodical man, whose allegiance to facts rendered him, in Holmes's estimation, unusually reliable among his profession. He greeted us with professional reserve, his face flushing slightly at the mention of Lord Pellingham's death. "I remember that night," he said after some deliberation. "Damp, low light, moon barely visible. We'd had heavy rains. The horse was found downstream with its leg caught in a broken fence post. The Baron, well, his injuries were consistent with a fall, though some said he might have been struck." "You heard the bell?" Holmes asked evenly. Tregennis rubbed the back of his neck. "That's the trouble, sir. I thought I did. Just one chime, mind you, around sundown. But I checked the gatehouse myself next day. No bell, not even a fixture." "Did you speak of it in your report?" "I didn't," he admitted. "Didn't want to appear fanciful. We were already under scrutiny given the Baron's standing." Holmes nodded gravely. "And you've heard nothing like it since?" Tregennis shook his head. "Until now." Holmes turned away without a word, though I noted his hands had folded tightly behind his back. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested we walk the stretch of ground between the gatehouse and the edge of the riverbank. The grass was tall but thin, mottled with damp leaves and the brittle remnants of heather. He moved slowly, his cane tapping the ground with each step, pausing at intervals to study the soil and undergrowth. Near the foot of the slope, just where the bank began to soften, he halted. Kneeling, he withdrew a small glass vial from his pocket and collected a dusting of granular particles nestled among the roots. "Ground iron," he murmured, "not native to this soil." I crouched beside him. What would account for it? "Filed metal, Watson. Shavings from repeated abrasion, perhaps from a clapper or resonating rod." A few paces beyond, he stopped again, this time studying a shallow impression in the clay. A footprint, only half preserved, but unmistakably recent. The heel was angled, as if the wearer had slipped slightly, and the sole bore a narrow edge, the sort one finds on older boots of ecclesiastical make. "Someone came here," Holmes said quietly, "not to walk, but to stand, and he came more than once." He straightened slowly, his face unreadable. What bell requires such attention when it no longer hangs? As dusk began to claim the landscape once more, we stood upon the old bridge, the wind soft against our collars. Holmes remained still for some minutes, his eyes fixed not upon the visible, but on some internal construct he alone could perceive. "Each witness hears the bell," he said at last. "Some even see it, and yet no one finds it. The toll house stands empty, the beam is bare, and still the sound persists." He looked at me then, his expression shadowed. "A bell that tolls without being seen, a sound without a source. Footsteps without a man. Why, Watson?" I shook my head, sensing the weight of something close but unspoken. He turned again toward the woods. "It is not the bell we must find, but the hand that believes it still tolls. For someone, somewhere, has made memory ring like metal, and it is not done ringing yet." That evening, seated once more in the small drawing room of the old mill house, Holmes requested of Lady Eugenia a copy of the original constabulary report concerning her husband's demise. She hesitated, whether from dread or distaste, I could not say, but presently produced a thin folio, its corners blunted with age, and the ink of its cover faded by handling and sun. Holmes read it silently by the firelight, his eyes scanning the pages with swift, economical precision. The official records spoke of inclement weather, a startled horse, and a rider thrown upon wet stones. A simple accident, the language implied. No villain, no motive, no mystery, and yet I saw Holmes's brow furrow. "The statement of the gamekeeper," he murmured, tapping one page, "asserts the Baron was seen riding east along the old toll road at dusk." "Yes," Lady Eugenia said quietly. "That was his usual path home from the club." Holmes nodded. "Yet the constable who found him the next morning places the body not on the eastern bank, but south of the bridge." He handed me the sheet. "An error, perhaps," I offered. "Or the absence of something we are not meant to see," Holmes replied. "This file names no assailant because it suspects none. But a clever murder may look very much like a careless fall, if viewed from the wrong bank." The next morning we walked once more to the site of the bridge. Holmes, with the constable's report in hand, paced the span from end to end, noting each indent in the stones, the subtle tilt of the path toward the streambed below. The underbrush had grown up around the descent, but certain contours, ancient erosion, long-dried scoring from hooves, remained faintly legible. "This is where they claimed the horse slipped," Holmes murmured, indicating a patch where moss thinned to bare lichen. "But consider the gradient. A fall from here would have pitched the rider into the stream due north." He turned to me. "And yet the body was found facing southward, as though the man had tumbled backward. You suspect he was struck from behind?" I suspect only that he did not fall from this spot. Holmes walked slowly to the low stone wall at the bridge's midpoint and touched the aged mortar. There is a difference, Watson, between a place of accident and a place of design. The latter may be chosen to resemble the former, but only if the builder trusts the world will not measure direction. He stared down at the water and added, almost to himself, and not all echoes carry upstream. Wishing to corroborate the toll house's history, I undertook a visit to the village rectory, where the Reverend Shipley, a mild man with a collection of moth-eaten sermons and a wheezing baritone, granted me access to the parish archives. These records, bound in faded calfskin and inked in copperplate hand, bore witness to a quieter, though not always less scandalous, history than the world acknowledged. In the volume marked 1864 to 1870, beneath baptisms and bans, I found a page dedicated to one Wilfred Hadlow, curate, aged 26, deceased by drowning near the toll bridge. The notes were brief, but the implications stark. Subject suffered spiritual collapse. No suspicion of foul play. Interment without eulogy. Shipley, observing my interest, cleared his throat with discomfort. Unfortunate matter, he said. There were whispers, you understand. Accusations of impropriety involving funds meant for widows' alms. The young man could not withstand the shame. I turned the page, where in a different hand another entry had been added. Toll house bell removed 3 days after burial, struck once at sunset. Why removed? I asked. Shipley shook his head. The villagers believed it summoned misfortune. I left the rectory in a chill, not entirely caused by the rain that had begun to fall. It seemed to me that shame and sound had once again made uneasy companions, and that some echo of the curate's fall still haunted the stones of Windsor Crossing. I relayed my findings to Holmes as we stood once more near the toll house, the rain now reduced to a mist that clung like breath to the eaves. He listened with rapt attention, his gaze sweeping the ridge of the roofline where, long ago, a bell had once hung. A village does not lightly remove its bell, he said, not without fear that it speaks louder than its tongue. Holmes stepped beneath the archway and examined the rusted bracket still affixed to the beam. See here, he said, gesturing with his cane. The bolt holes are not original. Someone replaced the mounting at some point, but then removed it again. That alteration was not done by parish order. It bears the mark of haste. He looked back at me. And yet, even without the bell, the sound remains. I felt a shiver stir the base of my spine. You believe this is the same bell Lady Eugenia hears now? I believe, Holmes said quietly, that someone wishes her to believe it is. And fear, Watson, is often more obedient than reason when it hears an old sound in a new night. We turned from the gatehouse, and neither of us spoke until the path had turned fully from view. Upon our return to the house, Lady Eugenia received us in a smaller parlour, where a single oil lamp cast long shadows over portraits whose eyes seemed to watch the door. She had summoned Mrs. Finch, a former housekeeper now retired and living in the gardener's lodge. Age had bent her spine and dimmed her vision, but not her memory, which proved clearer than either of us anticipated. I remember the night clear as glass, she said, her voice thin and dry. Lord Edmund had been in high spirits earlier. But when the bell rang, yes, the bell, he changed. Pale, like a ghost had walked across his grave. But there was no bell, I said gently. Her lips curled. That's what they all said, but I heard it, low and hollow, like something buried waking up. She looked past us then, to something only she could see. I warned him not to ride that night, said it was an omen, same as with the curate. He only laughed. She clasped her hands tightly. Now it tolls again, doesn't it? And the boy's gone. You think I'm mad, but I know its sound. The bell rings for those about to be taken. Holmes's silence, for once, said more than any protest could. We retired that evening to the study lent to us by Lady Eugenia, where Holmes paced in his usual fashion, his steps measured yet restless. He had arranged before him the statements of the toll-keeper, the drawing of the boy, the constable's report, and my notes from the parish register, all aligned with surgical symmetry as though awaiting dissection. "A curate, driven to shame, hears a bell and dies," he said. "A nobleman, accused by no man, hears the same and falls. Now a boy, sensitive to sound, disappears after a week of phantom tolls, and all upon the same strip of earth, at the same hour, beneath the same fog." He turned to me. "Do you see it, Watson?" "A design," I said slowly. "Each death preceded by sound, each sound untraceable." "Or," Holmes corrected, "each sound engineered." He tapped the dust sample with his finger. "Ground iron, residue from artificial friction. A bell that does not hang must still be struck. Someone has revived a mechanism long dormant, and they use it not to warn, but to wound." I said nothing. Holmes, in a softer tone, added, "The bell does not announce the hour, Watson. It marks the guilt of the hour's witness." The morning broke with a pale sun and an uncanny hush, as though the countryside itself recoiled from what it was about to reveal. Holmes had scarcely spoken over breakfast, rising from the table with a singular rigidity that I had come to recognize as forewarning. Within the hour, a knock at the door summoned us to the edge of the estate, where the stream curved sharply beneath a weeping willow whose branches swept the surface like fingers in mourning. A small crowd had already gathered: estate workers, villagers, the constable, and Lady Eugenia's steward. There, half submerged in the shallows and pulled to one bank by two solemn men, lay the body of Thomas Wriothesley. He looked younger in death. His pale features were composed, unbruised, with no sign of violence save the dampness of the grave into which he had not intended to lie. His clothes, though sodden, were undisturbed. One shoe was missing, perhaps swept downstream, but otherwise he seemed untouched by struggle. I crouched beside him and laid 2 fingers upon his neck. The skin was cool, the stillness absolute. Holmes stood behind me, silent. "It appears," I whispered, "that the bell has claimed another." Holmes did not respond. His eyes had fixed, not on the corpse, but on something beneath the boy's coat. Holmes knelt beside the body, and with a precision that bordered on reverence, parted the folds of Thomas's outer coat. There, nestled in the interior breast pocket, was a small object wrapped in a square of oiled linen. He withdrew it carefully and peeled back the cloth. Within lay a bell's clapper, short, thick at one end, and blackened by soot. The iron was pitted and dulled, yet unmistakable in shape and purpose. It bore the smell of ash and oxidized brass. "A silent tongue," Holmes murmured, removed from its mouth. He examined it in the shifting morning light, then turned it to reveal a faint indentation near the stem. "Filed down," he added. "This has been handled recently." The constable drew nearer. "What do you make of it, Mr. Holmes?" But Holmes did not reply. He was staring at the boy's hand, pale and clenched inwards. With care, he pried open the fingers to reveal a fragment of coarse twine and a fleck of hardened wax, as might be found upon sealing instruments. "Not suicide," he said softly. "Not accident, a staging." I saw the faint tremor in his jaw as he replaced the clapper in its cloth and returned it to the constable. "He tried to tell us," Holmes said. "He left the bell's voice, though none of us heard it, and then he rose, brushing the soil from his knees with a slowness that belied the certainty growing behind his eyes. By midday, the murmurs had already begun. The news travelled with unnerving efficiency through the village, carried in kitchen doorways and whispered across garden fences. The bell had tolled, they said, and now Thomas was dead. Some claimed to have heard it just past twilight the night before. Not loud, not even clear, but present, all the same. One toll, deep and mournful, floating over the trees like a summons for the lost. An old woman swore she'd heard it in her sleep. Another that her dog howled at the hour of its sounding. Though no 2 accounts agreed on the direction of the sound, all concurred on its purpose. "It's the bell again," muttered the baker's apprentice as we passed the green. It's got him too. It never took two before, said another. It's waking up. Superstition, of course, yet I could not entirely dismiss it. There was something insidious in the way the fear spread, not with hysteria, but with cold certainty. The bell had once been removed to silence its echo, and now, by some unseen hand, it had been made to speak again, and with each wordless toll, it claimed another listener who would not live to describe what he'd heard. When Lady Eugenia arrived at the stream, she did not at first seem to register what she saw. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as though approaching a tableau one might study, not a reality one must endure. But when her gaze fell upon the soaked form of her ward, something in her gave way. She made no sound, no cry, but her knees failed her all the same. Holmes and I moved at once to steady her, but she waved us off with a trembling hand and took one step forward, sinking to the ground beside the boy's still figure. Her gloved hands reached to touch his brow. I turned away, unwilling to intrude upon such intimacy, but Holmes remained fixed. At last she spoke, not to us, but to the boy. You said he'd heard it, she whispered. You said you would too, and I didn't listen. Her voice broke. He said it came not from the air, but from the stone, that it spoke through the walls and trees. He said it had waited, and that now it would finish what it began. She pressed her lips together tightly and closed Thomas's coat across his chest. I should have told him what I knew, she said quietly, but I was too afraid it was true. Holmes placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder, and for a moment even he seemed to bear the weight of what her silence had cost. We returned to the toll house once more that afternoon, though no words passed between us for some time. Holmes walked its perimeter like a priest circling a grave, pausing only to touch the old stones, to sniff the air, to listen, not for sound, but for the absence of it. The true ghost here, he said at last, is not a spirit, but an arrangement, a method designed to haunt the living by mimicking the dead. I watched him examine the wooden joists of the outer shed, noting again the scorch marks I had seen earlier, now in a new light. The bell was never buried, he said, merely displaced, and the fear it summoned has been kept alive, cultivated, by someone who knew precisely which memories to strike and when. You believe Thomas knew the truth? I believe he came close enough to recognize a face perhaps, or a pattern, and for that he was silenced not with a weapon, but with an echo. He turned to me then, his eyes unusually sombre. There is no spectre at Windsor Crossing, Watson, no ghost walking the moor. What there is worse. A mind that remembers what it did and wishes others not to. His gaze returned to the ruined gatehouse, and so it rings again, not to summon, but to bury. The sample Holmes had earlier collected from beneath the toll house rafter now rested beneath the lens of his portable field microscope, its fine metallic granules glinting faintly in the autumn light that filtered through the study's tall windows. He had spoken little since our return from the stream, but his quiet had not been idle. The moment Lady Eugenia retired to her quarters, Holmes arranged the samples, notes, and residue with the ritual precision of a man reconstructing not an object, but an idea. Observe, Watson, he said at last, sliding the instrument toward me. Iron shavings, too fine to have come from nails or hinges, but unmistakably ground by friction. Not the crude scatter of tools, but rotational wear. I peered through the lens. The particles had the appearance of blackened snowflakes, twisted by combustion and darkened by residue. My knowledge of metallurgy was rudimentary, but I understood enough to recognize this was no natural decay. Now consider the soot on the rafter, Holmes continued, positioned high, far from the hearth, and clustered irregularly around the roof's central beam. He laid beside the sample a diagram he had sketched, some contraption shaped like a bell, but without rope or clapper, its movement seemingly controlled by wind or heat. It is an aeolian bell, he said, employed in certain theatrical illusions. When heated or drawn through by pressure, it resonates faintly, mournfully, and intermittently. A ghost bell, designed to stir not the air, but the imagination. He looked at me, his expression grave. Not every haunting is born of spirit, Watson. Some are engineered by guilt and lit by fire. Holmes placed the crude diagram between us, then drew a second from his notebook. More detailed, now annotated in the margins with figures and footnotes I could scarcely decipher. It resembled a chambered bell, but with no clapper at all. Instead, several pipes ran from its hollow into a larger brass plate, below which was a shallow trough. He tapped the margins. A mixture of iron filings and sulphur placed beneath a shallow grate. Once ignited, the heat passes upward through these channels. The bell, being hollow and sealed, resonates at intervals as the pressure builds. But surely, I said, the sound would be constant. Not so, Holmes replied. It tolls irregularly. One long chime, perhaps two, then silence until the conditions recur. That is its genius. No one believes in ghosts that rattle like a metronome, Watson. But one spectral toll at dusk, that stays with a man. I studied the diagram again. And where would such a device be concealed? Holmes pointed to the sketch of the toll house. Beneath the eaves or in the rafters, perhaps partially buried in the culvert east of the stream. But one thing is certain, the residue confirms it has been recently triggered. I leaned back, feeling unease rather than admiration. Someone has not merely made this bell ring, Holmes. They have calculated its every chime. He nodded. And soon, Watson, I mean to find out who they intended to hear it next. That same afternoon, Holmes expressed a desire to visit the mute boy Eli once more, and I accompanied him down to the chapel green, where the child could usually be found drawing upon the flat stones with chalk filched from the schoolhouse steps. Eli was already at work when we arrived, crouched low with tongue pressed to lip, sketching what appeared to be a weather vane or signal post. Holmes lowered himself beside him without a word, and after a moment, took from his coat a new sketch, a simplified view of the toll house roof and its side elevation. He placed it before the boy and pointed. "Here," he said softly, tapping a corner beam. "Have you seen someone near this?" The child looked down, then up, his eyes unblinking. He took the chalk, and with calm assurance added a figure to the roof line, tall, angular, with a peaked cap and the barest suggestion of a beard. "Good lad," Holmes murmured. "Who is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he tapped the base of the drawing, where the boy had added a small spade. "Not a ghost, Watson," he said, "but a man who digs in silence." That evening, as the rain thinned to a drizzle and the hearth offered a quiet companionship, Holmes withdrew a slim case from his satchel and removed a worn portfolio of press clippings and private correspondence. I recognized it at once. A private archive he reserved only for the most obscure or scandal-tainted affairs. He extracted a yellowing photograph and laid it beside the sketch the boy had drawn. The resemblance was immediate. The line of the jaw, the cap, the faint wisp of beard. "This," Holmes said, tapping the photograph, "is Reverend Josiah Clark. The name means nothing to me." "It would not," Holmes replied. "He vanished from public life in 1878, disgraced after a lecture he delivered was exposed as an unattributed copy of Lord Pellingham's own published work. The scandal was quieted. Pellingham was a peer, Clark a mere scholar, but the man disappeared within the year. Some whispered suicide, others exile. And you believe he is here?" "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. "The boy's sketch matches not only the features but the posture. He has returned, Watson, under an assumed name, most likely, perhaps in the employ of the estate. Groundskeeper, caretaker, or something less formal, he lowered his voice. I believe we are dealing with a man who lost his name, his honour, and his future, and has since made it his mission to toll, once more, the hour in which he was erased. Holmes paced the length of the study with slow, deliberate steps, his arms folded behind his back in the manner of a man contemplating not just fact, but purpose. Consider his position, Watson. Clark was stripped of authorship, his life's work absorbed by another man, and his reputation ground to dust. What, then, does he preserve? His memory, I answered. Precisely, Holmes said. And more than that, his revenge, but not in blood, not in blades. No. Clark has engineered something far more insidious. A ritualized haunting. A bell no one can see, yet all are meant to fear. He paused, then added, he does not murder. He allows dread to take root, builds it layer by layer, until the mind falters, the heart flees, or the will breaks beneath the weight of unseen guilt. Thomas discovered him, or something he hid. Perhaps recognized his face, perhaps heard the bell and knew it was not ghostly, but human, and for that he was marked. I stared at the fire, feeling its heat without comfort. You believe Clark plans to toll again? I believe, Holmes said softly. He intends one final performance, but this time, Watson, we shall set the stage. It was the following morning that Holmes paid a quiet visit to Lady Eugenia, and with the tact that only he could render into insistence, proposed that a memorial be held for Thomas. Not a funeral, but a commemorative service at the old toll house, scheduled for dusk on the coming Thursday. She looked at him with haunted eyes. There is no stone. There will be, Holmes said gently, and its unveiling will give us more than closure. It may give us the man. She did not press him for further explanation, but consented with a silent nod. That afternoon, Holmes arranged notices to be delivered discreetly throughout the village, inviting a small gathering of trusted locals, estate staff, and clergy to attend the ceremony. We must draw him out, Holmes said to me later, not with accusation, but with honour. The one thing he was denied. And the bell, Holmes smiled faintly. Let it toll, once more, for him. He turned then to his notes, his posture composed. Yet I saw in his eyes the flicker of something far colder. Some men chase ghosts, Watson. Others build them. Either way, on Thursday, one of them shall be seen. The afternoon of the memorial was one of rare stillness. A high, thin mist drifted through the trees, softening the low sun into a pale golden disk that hovered above the western ridge like a dying coin. We arrived at Windsor Crossing just before the hour of 6, where a modest assemblage had already gathered. Lady Eugenia in muted black, the local rector with book in hand, a handful of villagers, and 2 gardeners from the estate who stood awkwardly by the stone bridge. Holmes, with that unhurried exactitude of his, surveyed the scene not with sorrow, but with something more akin to readiness. I knew, by the subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes, that every element had been arranged with careful precision, from the placement of the guests to the line of sight afforded by the toll house's eaves. He had stationed 3 plainclothes constables, discreet and familiar with their roles, behind the hedgerows, with a 4th concealed inside the old gatekeeper's lodge. The monument itself was a simple one, a flat stone set beside the path with Thomas's name and the phrase, "He listened, and he knew." The rector began to read. Holmes moved a step back, his hands clasped behind him, and then we waited, not for the bell, but for the one who would make it sing. At precisely 6:30, as the sun vanished behind the wood, the air shifted. It was not a gust, nor a gale, but something subtler, a pocket of pressure that seemed to exhale from the very trees. Lady Eugenia lifted her head, her eyes alert. The rector paused in his reading. Then it came, a single toll, low and mournful, floating over the clearing like a breath held too long. It was not loud, yet it pierced the silence with dreadful clarity, as if it struck not the ear, but the marrow. I saw a woman gasp, and one of the gardeners cross himself. The sound seemed to swell and then vanish, as though swallowed by the fog. Holmes gave the faintest nod. In an instant, the plainclothes officers stirred from the hedge, moving swiftly and without call. Two vanished behind the toll house. Another passed quietly through the brush. Holmes himself advanced, his face sharpened into a mask of intention. "I believe the bell has spoken," he said, not to me, but to the night itself. And within moments, a cry rose from within the rafters, not ghostly, but all too human. They brought him down carefully, though not without resistance. The man was wiry, his hands blackened with soot and brass, his coat torn at the elbow. He wore the cap of the estate groundskeeper, but beneath it, his eyes gleamed with something colder than guilt, something nearer to satisfaction. Holmes stepped forward, calm as ever. "Reverend Clark," he said. The man blinked. "I go by Mr. Greaves now." "Your aliases are many," Holmes replied, "but your hands betray you." One of the constables held up the object they had retrieved from the upper beam, a metal cylinder affixed with pipes, charred at the base and still warm to the touch. Holmes did not flinch. "You engineered a bell that needed no tower, no rope, only fear, and just enough wind." Clark said nothing. Holmes motioned to the cylinder. "It has rung before. For a curate, for a nobleman, and most recently for a boy." Still, no answer. Then Holmes stepped closer. But the sound was not the weapon. It was the echo, in the mind. "And you wielded it expertly." The man's shoulders sagged. He had been caught not by force, but by pattern, the very music he himself had composed. In the room where he was questioned, Clark sat, not like a man broken, but like one whose burden had merely been transferred from memory to record. He offered his confession not defiantly, but with a strange detachment, as though he were reading aloud from a manuscript long since written. "Yes," he said, "it was mine, every word, every sentence, the ideas, the proofs, the framing. I gave it to Edmund to review, and he published it under his name." His voice was low, colourless. "I was dismissed from the faculty, disgraced. I lost my standing, my lectureship, my name." He looked down at his hands. "I vanished, lived among churches and fields, a bell ringer, a pauper, and then I returned." Holmes asked, "To reclaim your name?" Clark shook his head. "To let them hear what they had silenced." "And Thomas?" There was a pause. "He found the sketch, one of the old diagrams. I left it by accident. He asked questions." "And so you let the bell toll again?" Clark did not reply, but his silence was confirmation. He had not sought blood, only remembrance, but the sound he had made had echoed further than he intended, into a boy's mind and out of time's reach. In the end, he confessed the act itself with the same flat tone, that he had encountered Lord Pellingham on the bridge 10 years prior, that words had been exchanged bitter and sharp, and that in a moment of fury he had pushed. "It was not premeditated," he said, "but I did not regret it." Afterwards, he returned to the toll house and reignited the legend of the widow's bell. Knowing the village's memories would assist him, the superstition became his veil, the sound his accomplice. And when Thomas uncovered the truth, not the murder, but the machine, Clark did what he had always done. He let the bell do the work. Holmes said nothing in reply. He only closed the portfolio, signalling the end. Outside, the bell no longer rang, but for those who had heard it, and for those who had feared it, its toll would linger in memory long after silence returned. We returned to Baker Street 3 days after the arrest, the chill of Windsor Moor giving way to the dense comfort of London's late autumn fog. The fire in our sitting room had already been lit, and Mrs. Hudson, with her usual efficiency, had laid out the tea tray with that instinctive gentleness which never sought to console, but often did. Holmes said little upon our arrival. He removed his coat, lit a pipe, and sat for some time gazing into the hearth. When Lestrade arrived an hour later, notebook in hand and moustache already twitching with bureaucratic anticipation, Holmes simply gestured for him to sit. "There will be no additional victims," Holmes began, "but the story itself remains unfinished unless one understands the instrument employed, not the man, but the medium." Lestrade made a gruff noise in his throat. Holmes continued. "This case was not one of blood, nor greed, nor even inheritance. It was constructed like a theatre, a carefully lit stage, a disembodied voice, and an audience primed to believe." He turned to me then, his expression softened by reflection. "You once said that the dead speak through silence, Watson. But in this instance, it was not the dead who spoke, it was the silenced." He drew a long breath, then began the tale anew. Not to recount the steps we had taken, but to illuminate the mind that had hidden in sound what it could not place in speech. "Reverend Clark," Holmes began, "understood one principle better than most men, that memory is not a passive chamber, but a resonant one. He did not simply wish to be remembered. He wished to create a sound that echoed within others, until they mistook their recollections for prophecy." He tapped the arm of his chair with the stem of his pipe. He did not ring a bell, he suggested it, and in doing so, made others ring it for him. Lestrade frowned. "But the bell was real, wasn't it?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, but its power did not lie in volume or frequency. It lay in anticipation. Clark placed it so that it would ring rarely, and only at moments of heightened silence. Dusk, funerals, crossings. The mechanism was erratic by design, the toll faint enough to permit denial. It offered no answers, only questions." He turned toward me. To a boy already unnerved by sound, already aware of tragedy, the toll became personal. To Lady Eugenia, it was the whisper of the past returning. And to Clark, it was vengeance delivered by ghostly proxy. I felt again the chill I had known beside the stream. "He made grief into a symphony," I said quietly. Holmes nodded, "and gave guilt the voice of brass." Holmes rose then and crossed to his desk, where he drew from a drawer a photograph, the same one we had studied in Windlesham. He laid it before me, and then beside it placed a smaller worn carte de visite. "This," he said, "was in Thomas Wriothesley's personal diary, discovered in his writing box." The second photograph was of the same man, younger, beardless, but unmistakably Reverend Clark. It had been annotated faintly in pencil, taken in Oxford, guest of Lord P. "Thomas found this among Lady Eugenia's effects," Holmes continued. "The family albums, unexamined for years, still bore the likeness of a man who had once shared friendship or scholarship with Lord Pellingham. Whether Thomas knew the nature of their falling out is unclear, but what he knew was this: the man haunting the moor was not a ghost, but a gardener." "And he told Lady Eugenia?" Holmes inclined his head. "I believe he tried, but she, like others, dismissed it as fanciful, the sort of imaginative burden we often place on the young." He took a sip of tea, then said, very quietly, "It is the great irony of youth, to be dismissed when they see clearly, and mourned only after they are gone. What remains most extraordinary," Holmes continued, "is that Clark never laid hand upon the boy. There was no force, no physical contact. He relied solely on suggestion, the deliberate construction of an atmosphere in which Thomas's perception became weapon and prison alike." He folded his hands. "Fear is rarely fatal, Watson, unless it finds no witness." Lestrade, silent until now, asked, "But why didn't he stop? Why not flee after Pellingham's death?" Holmes gave him a flat look. "Because it wasn't finished." He gestured toward the fire. "Lord Pellingham may have stolen his work, but it was society that turned Clark into a ghost, invisible, discredited, anonymous. The boy threatened to undo that invisibility. His death was not vengeance, it was concealment. I spoke without thinking, but he left the clapper. Holmes smiled faintly. A boy may drown, Watson, but not without one final sound. He left the bell's tongue for us to find, the one part Clark could not silence. And then, in a tone not unlike regret, Holmes added, "In the end, the boy rang the bell back." Holmes stood and opened a large tin box on the floor, revealing the disassembled remains of the Aeolian bell. The pipes were tarnished, the mounting frame bent from use, but the brass bore the unmistakable streaks of heat and soot. "This was found," Holmes said, "wedged between the upper beams of the toll house, concealed beneath a loose tile and bound with rope drawn through the gable slats." He indicated the soot-blackened cylinder, a mixture of oil, sulphur and iron shavings. The combustion created just enough pressure to vibrate the central plate, producing a low, metallic resonance. Lestrade leaned in. "And the sound?" "Carried by the culvert," Holmes replied. "The hollow beneath the crossing acts as a natural amplifier. At the right moment, with the air damp and still, the toll could be heard for nearly a mile." He touched the rim of the bell with a finger, almost reverently. It rang only when the conditions allowed, which made it seem all the more uncanny. "And the villagers," I added, "saw only what they were conditioned to expect." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. He forged not just a mechanism, but a curse, and it worked." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his features lit by the fire's flicker. "It was not the bell that killed," he said, "but the idea of it. Sound shaped by shame, wrung by memory, and heard only by those who already feared what it might say." He let the words settle, then added, "In the end, Watson, Clark did not wish to be remembered as a murderer, but as a man wronged, and like all such men, he mistook silence for injustice." Outside, the fog pressed gently against the glass, and within, the final echo faded, not in air, but in understanding. In the days that followed our return to Baker Street, I found myself unable to shake a certain weight from my thoughts, not of danger, nor of any unresolved aspect in Holmes's deduction, but rather of something more spectral, the residue left in the mind when a mystery is resolved but not erased. There had been cases more brutal, certainly, and others more intricately constructed, yet few had lingered in my memory as this one did. The mechanisms had been exposed, the perpetrator brought to account, and every clue accounted for. And yet, the unease remained, as though some thread, invisible yet intact, still tied the toll house at Windsor Crossing to a place deep within the human conscience. It was not the bell that haunted me, nor even the boy who heard it. It was the terrible precision with which a man had turned remembrance into ruin, not by raising his hand, but by cultivating the very silence we use to protect ourselves. The villagers had ceased their whispers, and the toll house now stood watched, not feared. But I could not walk the length of Baker Street without hearing in the rhythm of passing wheels some echo of that single chime, brief, measured, and unforgettable. It had been a case of clever devices and cleverer cruelty, but it had also been a study in the human need to be heard, and the dangers that arise when a man decides to make others hear what the world refused to believe. Holmes was not a man given to reflection, or rather, not the sort of reflection one shares aloud. Yet on the third evening following the case's conclusion, as we sat before the fire in our Baker Street lodgings, I observed in him that particular stillness which, when it did break, did so not with data or deduction, but with philosophy. He had set aside his violin, untouched that day, and now regarded the embers with a gaze that might have belonged to a man studying the structure of a dream from which he had only just awoken. "There is a peculiar cruelty, Watson," he said at length, "in the fact that memory itself is not governed by the will. We recall not what we wish, but what insists." I remained silent, unwilling to interrupt. Josiah Clark understood this. He knew that a sound, a mere vibration in air, could be shaped not to instruct nor even to alarm, but to accuse, and the bell he constructed, primitive as it was, did not toll in the ear, it tolled in the mind. He turned slightly toward me. Do you know what makes a bell so powerful, Watson? It requires no interpreter. No one mistakes its sound. It speaks in pure signal, a wedding, a fire, a death. And so, when one tolls where none should be, even the skeptic listens. I ventured, and Clark used that truth. Yes, Holmes said, his voice low. He used it as a language when no one would listen to his words. He leaned back then and closed his eyes. And when that failed, he made others hear what he could no longer say. Clark was remanded to the custody of the Crown, of course, though the precise nature of his sentence would prove complex. There was no legal precedent for a murder carried out by sound, no statute for death wrought by suggestion. Yet the evidence of the bell, the confession of the man, and the boy's tragic end were sufficient to ensure his confinement. Still, I could not help but wonder if the true punishment had preceded the law. For what court could add to the sentence already served? A life lived nameless, a mind burdened with orchestration, a bell tolled for none but himself. He had not fled his shame. He had crafted it into an anthem. In the end, the justice dealt him may have been official, but the justice he delivered himself was a quiet, lifelong one, played out with smoke, iron, and silence, in a theatre of one. I concluded my account some days later, as Holmes took to the violin once more, and the fog returned to Baker Street. The bell, dismantled and sealed away in the Yard's archives, would ring no more. Yet I suspect it remains, not in metal, but in mind. For at Windsor Crossing, beneath the ivy-dark rafters and the stones still damp with memory, a silence now rests where once a toll had dwelled. And though the world may forget its sound, I do not. It rang not to mark the hour, nor to summon the living. It rang to remember the forgotten. As the fire in our Baker Street hearth dwindled to a faint amber glow, Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, yet mind unmistakably alert. You see, Watson, he murmured, it was not the machinery of revenge that fascinated me, but the architecture of guilt. Clark did not simply wish to be heard, he wished to be remembered, feared, and, in some twisted sense, understood. The bell he forged was less an instrument of sound than a monument to shame, echoing not through air, but through conscience. I nodded, still absorbing the psychological intricacy of the case, and in the end, it was memory itself that became the perfect accomplice. Holmes opened his eyes and fixed them upon me. Indeed, my dear fellow, for what is a man's greatest prison, if not the place he carries within? What do you believe was Reverend Clark's gravest miscalculation, the creation of the bell itself, or his belief that guilt could be orchestrated like music? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd be most curious to know how you would have unravelled the echoes of Windsor Crossing. And if this tale stirred your mind as it did ours, do subscribe for more cases that test the limits of logic, memory, and morality. Don't forget to pass it along to fellow lovers of mystery. After all, some echoes are best heard together.